genre panel discussions, and this is world building. So I've got Angela with me. I've got Tom. Anyone who comes in and joins us later will introduce them as time allows. Go ahead and say hi, Angela.
Hello, Angela. I am Angela B. Chrysler. I am owner of Brain to Books, the host of the Brain to Books Cyber Convention. And you can find me at angelabchrysler.com. You will be able to locate all of our information also at b2bscon.com at the panel discussions page, where you'll find all of our links, books, etc. So you can find us later.
And Tom?
I'm Tom Falwell. I'm a fantasy author. I've had 4 books out, Rangers of Lorien series and Dragon Blood Throne Legacy, and soon to be a science fiction author sometime this year. And glad to be here.
And on that note, Tom, have you seen how well the Dragonbone cover is doing over on the Cover Wars right now?
I think I'm in 2nd place. But I'm in 1st place on the Character Wars, so Delina's taking them out.
I haven't checked in on anything yet. I have no idea how it's going, but
it's actually going pretty well. I'm Timothy Bateson, and as you can tell, I'm running a lot of the events over on the fantasy side. I can be found at timothybatesonauthor.weebly.com or timothybatesonauthor.wordpress.com. Those are my 2 hosts. I'm also all over Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram. So do come and check me out. And I've actually had a lot of fun this year setting up these discussion panels and various events, fantasy panels. So please go to the B2B Psychon site and check out what we've got going on. So as I said, today this is the first of 2 panels, and in this panel we're discussing world building. Now I know this is something Tom's very passionate about. And we had a discussion at one point yesterday as to whether or not certain people should be held as the epitome of fantasy. And it was decided they are world-building gods, but not necessarily good writers. So I'm going to actually touch back on that for you, Tom. Yesterday you said Tolkien is actually the top, one of the top guys in terms of world-building. Please tell people why you think that's the case.
It's probably just a personal opinion, and it's probably because that was the first time that I read a series of books that built a world to such detail. Now, I'm sure there's been plenty of others, and I've actually read some of them, but I never forgot the world of Middle Earth and how detailed it was. He had created the political, economic, all of it was there, even language, to the point that people were running around speaking Elvish. And I mean, they do that with Star Trek. There's people running around speaking Klingon and stuff, you know. And when people, fans and readers start duplicating like that, you know you've done something. And I would just say, I guess it's arguable between people whether or not Tolkien was a good writer. I thoroughly enjoyed reading The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion. But I've heard other people talk about how boring Bilbo's birthday was, and you know, and I hadn't actually ever thought of that. But now that I go back and I look at it, I can see their point of view, and I'm actually experiencing that with Robert Jordan right now. I'm reading Eye of the World, his first Wheel of Time book, and the very beginning of the first couple of chapters, I'm going, when are we going to start doing something? You know, he's doing all these
have a
descriptions.
question. Have you ever read Robert Jordan's books before, or is this the first read? I haven't either. I started them, and I had the same experience. I'm like, okay, Eye of the World is something people keep saying to read. I have tried. I can't get through them. I cannot get them started. They are hard.
It picked up after a couple of chapters, and now they're running from stuff. And okay, here we go. Some action.
Yeah.
I'm an action kind of guy. I like action.
So, yeah, so. And honestly, I think action is an element that's required in fantasy. I really think that it's, and that's something I'm going to plug my book here, and I do apologize. But when I was writing Dull Earned Shadow, one of my major things was, okay, they're going on this massive journey. They are walking from, in layman's terms, from Sweden to Norway, up and down the mountains. This has got to be done interesting because walking is boring. So I had things chasing them like gods and Dvergar, just to make it interesting. So they weren't just walking and being boring. And suddenly I turned it into a manhunt, and boy, that really got things going. But there's something about action and fantasy that really adds to it. I absolutely, there is something that it's required to make fantasy interesting. And I think that's where the world building really plays on that.
Mm-hmm. That, in my first Ranger book, A Whisper in the Shadows, the first half of the story is basically Beric, the main character, and this female Varda, we think elf, dark elf, and they're basically getting to know each other. He's going to help her, basically. And it's basically just them building a relationship between the two of them.
Right.
But that would be boring to me. So all along the way, there's all kinds of they come across a family being robbed, and Beric has to go in and save them, and just all kinds of, they get on a ship, and the lookout falls, and he's hanging upside down with one leg wrapped in a rope, and Beric crawls up there and saves him, and then Whisper gets washed overboard by the storm, and he jumps in the water to save her. So I got all this action going on, but all through that, it's changing because it starts out she is very arrogant towards humans.
Yeah.
That all the Varda are.
Yeah.
They're smaller than humans, dark-skinned, pointed ears, and they just have this attitude.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Like the high, kind of like the high elves in Tolkien, but even to a little more extreme.
Yeah.
And so all through this, she's learning to like Beric, and her opinion of him changes through this first half of the book. Over the course of all this going on, her opinion keeps changing to the point where they start really becoming close to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And romance comes a little later, but I mean, it just gets to the point where she begins to trust him.
Yeah.
And she's actually amazed at how he doesn't look down at people like the Varda do.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, the action is what carries it.
It does. It does.
And if I had just sat there and told all this, them getting to know each other, it would have been boring.
Yeah. There is this, I loved Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies. I loved it. I hate Jane Austen. I cannot tell you how passionately I hate Jane Austen. So when they came out with Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, it was wonderful. Every time the movie got gross and girly, every time a boring speech began, they just threw zombies in it to make it interesting. And one of my favorite moments is in the book. It's when Darcy confronts Elizabeth, and if it was non-zombie, if it was just Pride and Prejudice, it would have been you're a cruel man. I can't believe you did this to me. I can't believe you're like this. And he's like, yes, well, this is why I did what I did. You're just you're terrible. And he's like, I can't take it anymore. I love you. Will you marry me? How could you think of me? I would never do that. And she walks away. But in the movie, she takes the sword out. And she was trained in Chinese swordplay and karate. So she goes nuts with a sword. And he is like grabbing tools from the fireplace to fend himself off, and she's like slicing him up. It's great. It's like, yeah. And okay, so they're talking about their feelings and all that jazz, but who cares? And every time the plot starts to drag, every time things get a little romantic or mushy, boom, zombies. And it's great. There are so many movies in the world that could be improved with zombies. So yeah, absolutely. Action does something. I think we need to come
back to this one later, Angela.
We do.
I think we definitely need to come back to this, because remember, our next panel this afternoon is Mixing fantasy with other genres.
Yes, exactly. There is something about action that really does a lot to drive the plot and the story of any book. I remember so many times just being so bored with what I was writing myself, going, okay, something's got to happen here. And there were moments where I was purposely writing stuff, action scenes, people dying, things happening just for the sake of driving the action. And we're supposed to be talking about world building, but I think this is related.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not going to change the subject, but I have to say I hate zombies. I've had it up to here with zombies.
I'd say it's definitely a related topic, Angela, because action doesn't happen in a vacuum. You can't have action doesn't happen on a flat, stable terrain or in a stable situation. Action has to be driven by terrain. It has to be driven by the events going on around you. And I think that definitely ties back into the world building.
That's what we discussed yesterday with politics. I
definitely agree with you on that one.
With the war happening. And I guess that's also part of it. When you say world building, are you talking about the layout of the land, or are you talking about the culture? Are you talking about the politics of the era? When you say world building, what comes to mind for you?
To me, they're all interconnected. The politics and everything is really tied to terrain. I mean, you don't generally find villages in the middle of nowhere that aren't tied to any natural resource. And if you've got a village tied to a natural resource like lumber or water or even livestock, then you've got a political situation where, or either political or a social situation where you've got potential conflict built right into that fact that they have that resource available to them. So I don't really think you can take, when you say world building, it's not just the terrain, the lay of the land. It's not just the politics. It's not just the cultures. The whole thing has to be interconnected in some way, because you can't have any one of those elements in isolation. You know, you can have the greatest terrain landscape out there in the world, but if you don't have it populated and you don't have reasons for people being where they are, then you've got nothing at all. You've just got a fancy map of nowhere.
Yeah.
And I think that's something Tolkien did really well. When you go back and look at the Middle Earth maps, or when you look at the maps of Robert Jordan's material, and I'll say Robert Jordan is very good at his world building, but sometimes his storytelling is very Tolkien in the fact it takes too long to get to the key points. When you look at those maps, you can look down and you can go, okay, so they're here for this reason. For the most part, you know, towns, cities build up around rivers or natural fortification.
So I guess my question in that case is a map for a fantasy book. Is it mandatory? Do you need it? Does that add to the world building? Is it a tool that you should use to add to the world building? Is it necessary?
I think that's going to depend, I think, on whether or not the reader needs it to help clarify things. I've read stories without maps that I could get a good enough picture, and that may be why some people like Jordan and Tolkien did so much description, is because they weren't thinking of the map at the time. So they're doing all this description. They might have drawn the map later. I don't know.
Do you think fantasy authors today are too dependent upon having that map in the front of their books?
I don't know. I know that I'm not. I can start writing a story without a map and develop the map as I go along. But for the Rangers series, I actually wanted to create something as detailed and diverse as Tolkien's Middle Earth. I didn't want to copy him, but I wanted something that good of a setting for what I was going to do. See, I already had a main character, Barrett. I actually created him back in the late 1980s for a black and white comic book.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had him all along, and I was wanting to do something with him for novels. So before I even started, and he's always been a ranger, so D&D ranger. So I always thought of it that way, and I thought I need a setting, I need a world for him, complete new world.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat down and created the map, created the world, the economics, what these people, what their industry was, what this people's industry was, who had what economy and who did what and what each race was the best at and stuff like that. And I had all of that created before I ever started actually writing the story.
Right. Yeah.
So all of that kind of gave me inspiration for the story that developed. And it had a place to play in me writing a story as I went on to the second and the third book. All of that gave me something to work with. But I think people can, a book can be done, like I said, I've read fantasy stories that were just awesome, that didn't even have a map. Yet you knew what was going on, you knew where the people were going. But if it's going to be something on a grand and epic scale, I think a map is very helpful to a reader to help them visualize, unless you want to spend all your time describing like Tolkien.
I love Lord of the Rings is a great example of this. As I mentioned this yesterday and several other times in some videos I've done regarding Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. I was the nerd who sat there and watched the making of Lord of the Rings that lasted 72 hours. It was 4 separate discs per video, and it took me a week to watch through all of them, and I did it. I know things about Lord of the Rings that I wish I didn't know. One of the moments, it was in the second movie, it's just phenomenal. It speaks so much about Tolkien and his world building. They had done these movies, and the first movie was done. It had won its award. They were filming the second movie, and Peter Jackson recognized a problem with Lord of the Rings. He said, you really got to a point where people who did not know the story, people who did not know Middle Earth, still had no clue politically what was going on with the movie. So he rectified it. There is that moment where it's when they see the Oliphants for the first time, and Frodo and Sam are kidnapped. They're taken in by Boromir's brother, Faramir, and you see a map on a table, and Faramir is standing over the map with one of his soldiers, and they're pointing at the map. The finger pointing is Peter Jackson's own hand. That's the first thing. That moment with the map was actually filmed completely separate from the rest of the film. They're sitting there talking about, well, where are these people coming from? Where's this coming from? And when they looked back on it, Peter Jackson realized during editing that none of it made sense, that people who didn't understand Middle Earth would have no clue what Mordor is, where all these are. You really need to understand this is where Mordor is, this is where Osgiliath is, and this is where the White City is. And you have to see all of this to understand the relationship between the two cities, the Osgiliath and Mordor. So he right there on the spot stopped filming or stopped editing. He sat down with somebody, got a camera. It was like his home video camera. And he sat there and did the whole finger pointing and to fill that in. And then they plugged it in. And he was explaining that the reason why they had to add that is because it's so much a part of Tolkien's world to understand the geographic layout of Middle Earth, to understand politically why A, B, and C happened the way it happened. Osgiliath. And what is the name of the White City? Gondor. I keep thinking Gunir, but Gunir is mine, Gondor is his. Gondor and Osgiliath are so much a part of the politics that occurred for book 2 and book 3 that you must understand that layout geographically to comprehend why it's a big deal. And it just, I think that was my point. It was just amazing to, even in a movie setting, he still had to bring in a map.
Yeah, I think in something that scale, you definitely have to have it. I think, like Tom was saying, you don't always have to have the maps. but certainly as an author, I think it's an essential piece of tool, an essential tool. I mean, I've been a dungeon master for years, and one of the things I always start with when planning a new campaign is the first thing, like Tom did with the Rangers series, was to start with the map, start with the politics, start with the economics, and then look at what ideas those spark.
Mm-hmm.
I just noticed that Aziza has just popped in. We don't have video yet. Are you there, Aziza?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. We just don't have video feed for you, so I just wanted to make sure you were with us.
Yep, I'm here. I don't
So
have a headset, so I didn't want to have all the outside noise going on.
Okay, so you've been listening in for the last few minutes. What's your take on the matter of whether or not authors require maps for writing the fantasy, and how do you feel that they fit in with the reader's experience?
I agree with what you all have been saying. I do feel like it is important, even if it's not necessarily for the reader's side, but even from the author side, you kind of have to know what's going on to have that full rounded sense of who your people are, who your entities are, who your creatures are, and what their initial structure is, so that then you can kind of decide from there what's more important, what the story is, what the plot is, and then how all these other things that are day to day, you know, where the trash goes, or, you know, how often the weather changes and does this, that, and the other. And those are things that always play into the bigger part of the story.
Yeah. Another use for the maps I've always found, Angela, you were talking earlier about wars and things in the happening in the background. During wars, obviously, you're always in a situation where battlefields move from location to location. So you've always got the reference point of how far away are your characters from that fight. But you've also got the political boundaries changing. I mean, you go back and look at the First and Second World Wars, how many times looking at the battle maps from those times, that the front line of that battle, or a particular front line in a battle, has moved backwards and forwards.
All I can think of is South Korea.
Gain and lose ground.
South and North Korea.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at those boundaries, and when those boundaries are changing, that plays onto not just the politics, it plays onto the social and economic side of everything.
Now that's,
and I think without those maps,
that's actually a really, really good point there, Tim. I'm a huge MASH fan. I mean, obsessively so. Every January, I watch the entire season from beginning to end, and then the finale. Every year, like clockwork, that's what I do, every January. And I remember last year when I was doing my run, January 2017, they talk about the 53rd parallel, or the 54th parallel. They talk about the front moving, and of course they're a MASH unit. They have to get up and they have to move. But I didn't understand until I went onto Wikipedia and I typed in 54th parallel, and I got to see this line. There's North Korea, there's South Korea. And then it was an animated GIF, so it showed you how it moved during the entire war, beginning to end. And it was astounding. That changed the definition of this border. It went all the way down, up, down, and at one point, South Korea was that much on the map, and North Korea was like this. And then it went back up again, and then it settled where we have it today. But it wasn't until I saw that map that it completely changed my perspective. Now I know what North and South Korea look like. I know what they look like today. I had watched MASH. I watched them pick up and bug out. I'd watched them move. I'd watched them relocated. I'd heard them. But to see that map really spell out how often they moved and where they moved to, suddenly the word Mobile Army Hospital took on a whole new meaning. That map, that word building, just changed the way I thought about the show.
I think geography can play a big role in the story as well. I mean, what you're talking about, borders, but also just the geography itself. In my Ranger series, the third book, there's a huge war happening. And you've got this huge army, and without the map, you'd say, well, it'd be easy enough for reinforcements to come around behind them and surround them. But they can't, because behind them is a sheer cliff 300 feet high that spreads clear across the continent. The only way reinforcements can even get there is they got to go all the way around the ends to get there. They can't come down through the middle. And
No.
so it plays a big, the geography plays a big part in how the battle goes about and how the reinforcements can't get where they need them to be.
Now, that being said, you have the opposite problem where I'm thinking specifically of Victor Hugo and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He could have used a map. I remember reading 150 pages on the exact blueprints of the Notre Dame Cathedral. I don't need 150 pages of the Notre Dame Cathedral, but I got 150 pages layout of this cathedral. And the only reason why he did it was, I mean, the book starts with, this is what the Notre Dame Cathedral looks like inside and out. And it helped so that when I sat down and read the rest of the book, the actual story, I understood and I could see everything beautifully. But good God, a map in that book and removing those 150 pages would have really been a lot more enjoyable than, yeah. And same thing with Les Mis. I remember reading, it was 30 pages of a garden, just layout of this garden. And I'm like, okay, lovely garden, great garden. What's the point? Finally, the 30 pages of layout of this garden description served the purpose for a page-and-a-half description of a boy jumping over the wall, landing on the other side of the wall, and taking off, that you would not have been able to understand without comprehending the layout that took 30 pages to describe. Victor Hugo was notorious for crap like that.
Yeah.
And I that's where a map really could have done a lot to help him.
When I started writing, one of the problems I had, having been a Dungeons and Dragons dungeon master,
Oh, yeah.
one of the problems I had was describing everything in exact detail.
Yeah.
How wide the hallway was, how far away something was precisely, just having all that description. And my editor says, you don't need all this. And I had to learn to get a little more general in that, or I was going to end up having a lot of pages of nothing but here's how it looks, like you was talking about, here's how it's laid out precisely.
You see, here's how I address that, Tom, as a dungeon master, and it's actually served me well as a writer. I think that the biggest thing is don't get too bogged down in the detail.
Yeah.
You know, it's very easy to say, so and such a situation is long range for your bow. It gives people an idea that it's fairly distant, but without being out of sight distance. You know, knife throws distance is what, 10, 15 feet roughly?
We're running a campaign. Yeah. We're running a campaign
So-
right now, and I'm huge on the Pathfinder maps and the characters. And okay, I want to see exactly where my character is. I can run 25 spaces. And other people are, especially my DM, my husband, he's like, no, don't worry about the blocks and the spacers. And he prefers the verbal description. But,
Yeah.
and this is where D&D is a great example. I'm glad you brought that up. That is a phenomenal example of how word building really affects gameplay, decision-making, structure. Really, absolutely.
It's very dependent with D&D as to which version you play. I played from original Dungeons and Dragons through first edition, through second, through third, through what was basically the strategic mess that was fourth, where you had no choice. Maps were it.
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
I haven't played fifth.
We just started fifth.
I think one of the interesting points that comes up from that, though, Angela, is as people who've played role-playing games as dungeon masters and things like that, sometimes I think the maps can be a hindrance to storytelling.
Not
And
with
I think
fourth
that's where
edition.
your DM right, okay. In fourth edition, the maps are a hindrance to pretty much everything. But I think the DM who's turned around and says to you, I prefer your descriptions to, I can move so far, I can take this action. Getting that storytelling aspect of the description actually feeds better into a story than going, okay, well, this is what's possible with the map. Sometimes maps make things too stringent, and I think sometimes we have to look at alternatives. Tom, you've got that 300-foot cliff face across most of the continents.
Yeah.
You said 300, I think.
Approximately, yeah.
Yeah.
It's basically a sheer. It's the divider between what I call upper Her and lower Her because of a cataclysm that happened in the past, and it just left this sheer rock face across the continent.
Yeah.
So I had, as soon as you mentioned that, I had visions of reinforcements rappelling down the cliff face.
Well, there's a mountain chain on the top side of that cliff face, so that they would have to climb over the mountains to get to that.
There was this one conversation we had last week, and this is example of the word building versus do you need the maps, do you need to rely on that description, where the DM described and we all came up with a variation of, okay, well, this is here, and then one of the characters said, I gotta see this. So we laid out the map, we started putting pieces together, and it was interesting because then we got to see what everyone saw. And one person had done action A, B, and C from the opposite side of the room, not realizing that that's where they were. So we shuffled everything, and a rock had fallen. They were fighting from behind a rock. And we were using my TARDIS as, it's a dice roller, so we're using the TARDIS in the middle of the map as a rock. And at one point, I did the TARDIS sound and lifted up the TARDIS, and the rock was gone. And it completely changed the way they did the strategic, their how they were going to fight. Like, everything changed with the geography. And that being said, that was one of the things where, for me, the map is mandatory in storytelling. Either for you have to be really, really good at describing layout that's going to matter. And that's going to matter. That's the important part there. Very, very quickly and very, very clearly. So I can almost say that if you have the skill of doing that without needing the map, good for you.
I'm going to show my age here. I started playing before D&D.
Oh,
I started with Chainmail.
Yeah, I knew that.
By Gary Gygax.
Yep.
And we didn't really have maps with Chainmail. It was so I learned to describe things without actually having it. I mean, I would if they were in a dungeon, I would draw,
you had a map.
Hallways and all that.
You had a map.
But I wasn't thinking about the size so much then. But I haven't played 3rd edition and on. 2nd edition was the last time we actually played, and that was quite a while ago. But but the thing for me, what made it all work for me is by playing Dungeons and Dragons as well as other role-playing games, I learned to react according to the players. Yeah. I didn't sit there and make a big detailed thing and say, okay, no matter what you do, this is going to happen. I just gave a general thing, and then depending on how they reacted, I'd get an inspiration. Oh, that makes me think of something I can do that they ain't going to expect.
Now,
and I'd throw that in there, and I got to the point where I was actually being praised by the players for my ability to ad-lib.
Yeah, improv is. So that's interesting. The difference between a DM and a writer is a DM gets to see the immediate reaction of their reader in front of them. So you learn how to write a story based on exactly what you've got in front of you, and you know, should I give more information? Should I take more information away? How should I do this? I'm never ever
That
going
also,
to.
I think that also plays into pacing.
Yeah, pacing is so
That plays into pacing.
touchy. I love pacing. I think of everything I do with writing, pacing is my favorite. When I laid out my book and my story, I actually evolved the story around the world building and the geography. The plot came second, the story came second, the geography came first. So I spent a lot of my time on the geography, on the weather, on the solstice, everything located in Norway up by the Nordic Circle. So I had to look and see, are they in their long days here? Is there the midnight sun now? What's going on weather-wise during this time period? And I had, okay, they're at point A, they need to get to point B, but there's this mountain and fjord in their way. So suddenly I had the entire story evolved around the geography in the world. I went, okay, I've got this problem. My characters need to get here. How do they do it? And my first thought was they trek it over, but there's mountains, there's fjords, there's no way they can make this trek. The logical, what they really did when anyone in Norway needed to get anywhere before they had E6, Highway E6, they used the ships. Everything was done via ships. And that's why they sailed all the way around. So I'm like, well, I guess my characters are going via boat. I got them to point A, point B, and suddenly it's, well, now you need to get them to point C and back down to point D. And I had, the resources immediately became the answer. Well, what do they have available to them? They don't have roads. And they had river, they had boats, and that was about it. So suddenly my book was taking on a completely different shape. And I realized when I had done all of this, I had laid out a fantasy map. And I realized I needed clearer answers because I didn't understand what the terrain in Norway looked like. So I pulled up an actual map and I studied it. And I realized that the places that I was talking about, some of them really did exist, but I had reversed it. So I had to flip them. So suddenly, instead of them going south, they were going north and then catching a boat and going around south. And it suddenly became a completely different book. I had 3 different books of the same story. Book 1 was when I had them walking. Book 2 is when I had them going south and then north. And book 3, the one that actually made it into print, is when they go north and then they come back down south. And it was, I'm writing book 3 now and I'm doing the exact same thing. The first thing I did was I pulled out a map of Norway and I'm like, okay, they're here. They need to go here because of X. How are they going to get there? And now we're back to that word building.
Yeah.
And we're looking
I'm
at weather.
bringing Aziza in at this point.
I'm sorry?
I know Aziza's been over there pretty quiet. What are your feelings on that, Aziza? Having to switch things around because of the reality for the maps?
I think mine is a little less challenging, as I tend to write little less of fantasy and more of the contemporary fantasy. So when I'm writing about places, I'm in the metro area of Atlanta, Georgia, in the U.S. So there we have everything. You know, you have a man-made beach just right around the corner. You have, we're an hour from pretty much everything, sometimes 2 hours, a little bit to the beach. So I'm able to, I think, pull in a lot of that just because I like to travel. I feel like I'm in a good place. And so I get the exposure to all, I get the mountains. And so being able to see these things and experience them and actually walk, in essence, in my character's shoes as I'm looking at the world they're going to be in, I think it's a little easier for me than it would be. I do have a couple of books that have like in places, other countries. Belize tends to be my favorite, but it's a place that I've been a few times. And so I'm able to take my experience, record my experiences then, and the pictures, and then be able to have those things to reference. So not just the books and the maps, but the actual being there.
Okay. Yeah, I understand what you mean. I mean, one of the things I found, I think sometimes either being able to look at the maps or getting your feet on the ground is very important if you're using a known location as a basis for what you're writing. One of the things I found, I don't know how well this is going to show up this is part of Seattle, and you'll see this red line going down. Originally, that red line went straight down. Then I got out there and I looked at the terrain, and I'm going, okay, I've got to change this. This chase is just too static in the fact that it's got one location. I think, Tom, you were saying that you had people going in and out of buildings around and about the towns and what have you, and getting caught up in various locations. And that was definitely something I had to look at, because knowing the terrain of where that chase was happening, a straight downhill chase was just boring.
Yeah.
But then once I realized I've got a whole inner city campus over here, for one of the universities. Now I'm suddenly in and out between buildings, up and over grass verges, round and about parking structures. The whole concept of the chase changed. So like with Angela, when you realized what the reality of the terrain was looking like,
Yeah.
from pulling up those maps, it definitely changes what you've got to do. And that's where the maps help. But I also think that the map in this particular case was restrictive, because originally when I looked at it, I didn't see the buildings. I had a map, but I didn't have a real idea of the scale of the layout of the campus. I just had street level. And then you look at it in 3D or you look at it in person, and it changed everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point on that. Here in Oklahoma, if you look at a map of Oklahoma, you'll see an area that says Red Rock Canyon. And he shows a road going down into it. And you think, oh, okay, there's a road. But it ain't till you get out there and get on that road that you realize, ooh, this is a steep road. As a matter of fact, if you're pulling a trailer and trying to get out of the canyon, you're going to probably strip some gears, because it is, I mean, almost straight up incline getting out of that canyon. And you can't see that on a map.
You know, it's funny. I did the zombies. I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
I did the when I done my, I'm going to sit down and look at the map of Norway and Sweden and then put everybody, all the chess pieces where they need to be on the map. I did the exact opposite for Zombies from Space and Vampires. And I'll tell you, the writing was completely different. The experience was completely different. It's in Alexandria Bay, which is 3 hours from where I live. I've been to Alexandria Bay. I've been to 1,000 Islands. I've been to Singer Castle, where my characters head to. So when I wrote it, I knew where I was going. I knew what it looked like. But my timing, and I think this is something I'm going to be working on with the revision, is I still am not happy with it, because even though I've touched and I've looked at this place, imagining where my characters are, it's very one-dimensional to me. I'm like, okay, so they're on the river. I got that, and I know how big this river is. I know how many islands are in 1,000 Islands. It's more like closer to 5,000 islands in 1,000 Islands. But I've got these characters, and I think what I'll be doing next is pulling out my map, just like I did with Norway, pretending that I can't physically go there and touch this place, and lay out the characters like, okay, you're here, you need to get to Fort Drum here, and it's going to take you X amount of time. And instead of trying to wing it, I'm probably going to look more specific at how long is it going to take you? What road are you going to take there? And I'm probably going to map it out the same way, because I need the mountains to take into account, because I need the hills, I need the roads, I need the rivers to affect the decisions the characters make. And when I revise the book, that is probably the route I'm going to take. And then I'm going to go up to Alexandria again and execute and see if it actually works. And hopefully it will. But again, to look at, and I know you and I have talked about word building with Seattle. And I can't remember, you built the world of Seattle in your fantasy, and then you went to Seattle, correct?
I had an advantage in that respect. I started writing the story set in Seattle, but I have a resource who lives in the same house, and I happen to be married to, who's actually lived in the city. So I had that in advantage. So she had an idea of scale, where things were and everything.
Yeah.
And my first story actually just took place in a museum and out in the wilderness. I
Yeah.
didn't really have to connect them because of the way I did the crossfade between the two scenes, and then came back to it.
And the other,
So that really didn't have to matter.
Yeah.
I knew what a museum looked like. I
right.
knew what the wilderness looked like. When I started writing the novel and the other stories, it became important to do the research on Seattle. And yeah, I was using Google Maps to
Oh yeah, Steve.
build everything well ahead of time. And then last February, I actually got to Seattle and went, oh crud! I got this chase scene going uphill. It's actually downhill. That changed everything, and that was the map I showed you before. You
Yeah.
can't see on a flat map which direction that hill's going.
Yeah.
There aren't that many tools that tell you what elevation is this particular address in a city.
Yeah.
No, you've got to go and actually physically put your feet on the ground and go, yeah, okay. So actually from here, I can't see this on Google Maps, even in 3D.
No, yeah. I did a lot of YouTube tours as well.
But that's camera angle.
Yeah.
Now, on the actually at ground level, I'm looking down this hill, and I can actually see buildings I didn't think you'd see.
Yeah.
Because I didn't take into account the height of the structures around them.
Yeah.
It's like from the start of the chase. Yes, you can see the Columbia Center. It's a lot taller than I actually thought. You know, you can be told it's so many feet high, and then you can look at the structures around it. They're so many feet high and what have you. But then you get actually onto the ground level, and you go, I can actually see this above those buildings. This is where he's actually.
But here's my question: does it feel like Seattle? Does your book feel like Seattle?
That's what I'm working on. That's going to be that's where you have to bring in the senses and
I've been in New York
and everything.
I have been in the city so much that when I watch New York City on TV, I can go, that's New York, and I can go, that's not New York. They're not New York.
Yeah.
One of my favorite moments in Men in Black when they are on the Jersey Turnpike. No, they're not. I've been on the Jersey Turnpike. That is not the Jersey Turnpike. And there is no cars around. It's one car in the middle of nowhere, and she's giving birth to an octopus. And I'm just like, I've been on the Jersey Turnpike. No. Bad copy. So to copy that feel of a city in a book, that's, you want to capture the aura, that feel, the buzz inside.
If you're using a real location contemporary to the time you're writing, you can't really get the feel of it unless you've actually been there.
And that's what I'm curious about. Does my book feel like Norway? I don't know. That's what I'm eager to see, is does it feel like Norway? And I would love to read your book and then go to Seattle and see if it feels like Seattle. That's what I want. That right there, that's what matters to me. You know when you do it right when. Like,
yes.
Stephen King does this all the time. He always writes from his hometown, Maine. So when you read a Stephen King book, you are in Maine. That is what Maine feels like. And whenever I watch one of his movies, it feels like Maine. And I'm thinking specifically of Storm of the Century. That book feels like Maine, even though they've got so many botched accents. It feels like Maine. And at least that's what I imagine Maine feeling and looking like. And whenever I think about going to Maine, I have never been. When I think about going to Maine, I guarantee you that's what it feels like, because the author was born and raised there.
One of the things I'm having to work on very carefully, and one of the reasons I took certain tours and things of buildings when we were in Seattle, watching the old Frasier episodes. Out of Frasier's apartment, you can see the Space Needle up close. It's like he's within like 300-400 feet of the Space Needle.
Mm-hmm.
There is no apartment complex anywhere near that close.
Yeah.
So when I was talking about the Columbia Center and everything, it was very important for me to get shots on camera of what you can and can't see from there.
That's interesting. You mentioned Frasier, and I'm like, oh, I didn't realize that it was in Seattle. Seinfeld is in New York City. That is New York. That's what New York feels like. It's what it looks like. It's what it smells like. That is New York. The show Friends, that is not New York. That is not New York.
Right.
And
A lot of the time when they tell you it's a Seattle setting, a lot of the time they're filmed in Vancouver.
Yeah, and it's amazing how, and to me that really, it's that aura, it's that feel of, okay, are you really bringing this back with you? Are you really able to depict the feeling of it inside? Is it there? And there are places.
In terms of setting up in fantasy, what key elements in terms of your world building do you think actually bring you to the locations?
Norway. There's something about the Norse and fantasy. It's where it was birthed. So, and I see this a lot with a lot of different fantasies, with a lot of different movies, with everything. Whenever you mention elves and dwarves, it takes you back to the Norse gods. So for me, that takes you back to the North and Norway, and especially Game of Thrones. I see a lot of Iceland in Game of Thrones from what I've seen from it. I'm looking for the landscape. I'm looking for the culture, for the people. And it really is hard because I'm thinking about Seinfeld right now again. If I were to write New York, it would definitely be the smell. I can smell it. I can see it. It would be that foggy, crappy New York weather that we always get here with the rain. It looks like crap here. It really does. It rains all the time. And then there's the humidity. You can almost see the humidity. It's thick. It's sometimes it's thicker than the fog that we get here. That's how thick the humidity here in New York is. And then when you add the street to it, it's gross. It's a gross, wonderful, disgusting humidity, and it smells. And I'll tell you, all of New York smells like hot tar pavement with urine. That's what New York smells like. Sorry. And it's in the summertime, that is what it smells like. And when you're creating a world like that, for me, the smell, the bodies, the crowdedness, the tension, that constant, everyone's got a place to go and everyone's got a place to be and everybody is late at the same time. That feeling really captures what New York is in that sense. So I think when you write about a place, you are trying to capture the culture mostly, I think. Really, it's the people. Absolutely, I think it's the people. Because it's the relationship between how the people are reacting from one point to the next, how they're reacting to their element, that really lets you see the element.
And vice versa about how the element is making them react. It's not always that. It's that balance. There's a back and forth between while I may have prepared for X, Y, and Z, whatever's happening around me is forcing me to do now A, B, and C. That it has thrown a wrench in my plans.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I live in a valley over here in Alaska, and one of the things I find a lot of weather, the weather conditions out here. I'll just give you a hint. We get wind speeds that are borderline. They're borderline hurricanes. Well, they feel like they're borderline hurricanes. We get wind speeds up to 50 miles an hour quite regularly through here, but that's because I'm between two glaciers and three mountain ranges, and it literally channels winds into the valley and creates these higher wind speeds. The local weather groups have stopped trying to predict our weather simply because the geography makes it so difficult to pin down. I see Aziza just unmuted. I think you had something to say on that.
Yes, and because of all the things that are being done, all the pollution, all of the disturbances with, putting up wind turbines, which are now changing the way the birds are flying, and all of those things are making it that way, not just where you are, but even where I am. I mean, we hadn't seen a tornado in downtown Atlanta ever that I know of, and yet 5 or 6 years ago we had one. And, people were completely taken by surprise. And that's because we've changed the geography based off of the buildings. They started all this construction on these outside places. So now you're getting all of these floods, like that flood that we had 5 or 6 years ago, that there was the whole west side of the town that was underwater, and everybody's going back trying to dig up the plans to see, and none of these places were in a floodplain. But what's happened is all of this construction now miles up or down the road has now completely adjusted the geography. And so now everywhere which was originally safe is not safe anymore, or there's now this expectation that these floods and these other natural quote unquote disasters will be happening because we've changed the geography by building or tearing down.
That's actually an interesting point, because I think that's when we go into world building for fantasy settings and things, I think that's something we don't take into account enough, is our impact on the environment around us. Like you said, building in a particular location can certainly change how the weather and everything behave, or how natural disasters affect locations. It's definitely something, just if you look at historically, people diverting rivers to provide better water flow for particular towns, locations, or whatever. How's that affected everything out in the far western states? We've got droughts happening in 2-3 states out there right now because water flow was diverted for irrigation. I think, if I remember reading rightly, that was how that happened.
I'm not certain. I don't know about out west.
I know a large amount of water gets pumped out to Vegas, for example, and that's certainly affected the water flow of the rivers it's coming out from.
Yeah.
There's concern about that right now with the Nestle being allowed now to pump all of this water out of some of the places in California. They're concerned because, like, some of these lakes, they've taken pictures between these last 10 years, and you can see visually that there were places that were completely underwater that are now no longer underwater. And the sources that are feeding these places now are being controlled by Nestle, and no one knows what's really going to happen. Are they going to do the responsible thing? Is it going to be a situation where they'll share? Or will it be like Georgia, Alabama, and Carolinas, where we've had a water war going on for 3 years based off of what the Army of Engineers, how much they want to allow to flow down through Georgia, South Carolina, and through Alabama?
So yeah, I think that's something. I'm glad you brought that up, Azita, because I think that's definitely something we overlook when we're doing world building events and things. When we look at our maps, is looking at how things have changed over time and how that affects people. I can certainly imagine situations, for example, in a fantasy setting where someone dams up a river and it affects people down river from there, in terms of what resources they now have available, and the conflicts that are probably going to come out of that. So I think that's a great place to end everything, unless anyone's got any other points they want to bring up.
I don't know anything about as far as modern. I'm not writing about what's modern here, but I mean in the world of her that I created, a lot of this is taken into account. There's a great inland sea that was created by this giant explosion in the past. There's a great inland sea with a volcano in the middle of it, and this entire sea is sulfuric. It's undrinkable. And so there's no people living anywhere around it. And the closest, I think in the first book, I talk about a village that's probably close to the sea, but it's at a point on a river that flows towards that inland sea, so the water they get is fresh. By the time it gets to the inland sea, it's contaminated. So, but I mean, that's
So if
something
that
that I
was coming,
take into account for how people are laid out in my world. Is there's no one living around a place where the water's poisonous. So
Now, one of the things that I did when I was working on Dollar and Shadow and I was mapping everything out on Norway, my book is a fantasy. It doesn't take place. It is high epic fantasy in the sense of it doesn't take place on Earth as we know it. It's Elfheim and Midgard and Asgard. And one of my fellow authors, when I was working on the book, kept arguing with me, if it's fantasy, why are you being that? Why are you using a real life map? Why are you making sure that if the map does this, why are you making sure that your characters go that, even if it means an extra 2 days of work trying to figure out which direction this is? And I don't know why. I was absolutely adamant of no, it has to be exactly as it is in Norway. And there were moments where I said, you know what, this is a map from 1,000 years ago, so maybe the land shifted, maybe, you know, especially there were moments where I'm like, okay, that city wasn't here until this time period, so it was all trees at that point. So it wouldn't look like that, or maybe the river shifted. So there was a lot of time lapse, 1,000 years, that I had to take into account when I refigured the map. It was very difficult. And the whole time I had this author saying, but you're writing a fictional fantasy. It's not a historical fiction. Why do you have to be this exact? And I couldn't answer him. I still can't. I cannot tell you why I have to be so detailed with making sure. I think it's because I am looking for a sense of realism. Because in the sense of Zombies from Space, when I wrote out the landscaping and I didn't do it with a proper map, to me it wasn't believable. It was just, okay, so there's a straight line and they're just walking the straight line the entire time unless they cross a river. And that's not the way the road is. It's not the way the world is, especially here in New York. There is no flat, straight anything here in New York. So for me to write that in the book, I'm just like, because it's not realistic. Anyone who sits down and looks at Alexandria Bay will go, okay, that's crap. And then so for me, the fantasy world, basing it off of something realistic like the landscapes here, I think builds this massive sense of reality to it. So it feels real, even though it's fiction. And I think that's really what we're trying to achieve with word building. Is we're trying to achieve a sense of realism through creating this world, making it believable.
you want flat and straight. Route 66 in Arizona. Flat and
Never
straight.
I was just telling Joe, I have never seen anything like this. I live in the mountains. There is no such thing as flat and straight here.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I've seen pictures. It scares me to death. I don't know why. I see pictures like that and I'm like, oh, no, we're on my mountain. It's like a warm blanket over here constantly wrapped around you.
It's a road to infinity.
I can't imagine.
Yep.
It's like, no.
Angela did answer her own question though.
Go ahead.
That
Jump
is
in, yeah.
that frame of reference, and so you're using a real map, and that's how your mind works, and you know that's what feels real to you. And so if that's the same idea you want to portray, then of course you would use something that feels real to you so that you have a frame of reference to start from. And yes, you take your liberties here and there, but the core and the starting point is something tangible to you that you can actually look at and reference and say, this is something I can relate to. And so
Yeah.
I hope my readers will be able to relate to it as well.
That's
Yeah.
I think that's what's missing is the concept of going around something. You always have to go around. Always. You're always going around trees, or you're going around forests, or you're going around mountains or lakes. You go around things here. And you're talking about Route 66 and straight land, and you go through things.
Yeah.
We don't go through things.
I may have created a fantasy world. You know, I didn't use Norway or something, but I created my own little continent, basically. But when I start talking about what the forest looks like, guess what I'm thinking of? I'm thinking of the forests I've seen. So maples, oaks, you know, I know what that looks like because I've been in them. So that's where my descriptions come from. They come from my frame of reference.
I went down to Virginia last
So
year.
what we're saying is,
And there were trees, there were things there that I have never seen. I spent most of my time looking at this tree going, what is it? It's like a giant rhododendron. 2 days of that, and I finally had somebody take pity upon me, and he went, it's a southern Mongolia tree. And then it attacked me.
so basically what we're saying is,
It did. It attacked me.
So what we're basically looking at here is each of us has our own different way of doing the world building and what we rely on in terms of creating that realism. But if it doesn't feel real for us as writers and we put it down on the page, it doesn't feel real.
Yeah, that's it, I think. Yeah.
Unless it feels real when we're writing it.
Yeah.
Then we're not doing justice to
that's exactly it.
World building or research we've done.
Yeah. I can see Tom reading Zombies from Space going, well, I don't see a problem here. They're going straight. That's the way it is. And I'm going, no, it's not. They're not going around stuff.
I don't know if you can see me reading Zombies from Outer Space or not.
No. They're actually aliens. They're not zombies. They're aliens.
You have no idea how fed up with zombies I am. I've seen so many zombie movies, read so many zombie books.
They're aliens. See?
They're still zombies.
See the spaceship? They're aliens. They just look like zombies. They're human-eating aliens.
Zombies, werewolves, and vampires. I've had enough of them. All of them.
I did too. That's why I wrote the book.
Okay. So I know Tom's not going to be reading my material then.
I've had enough of them that I don't want to write them. That don't mean I won't read them. So I'll just say that. I don't want to write about zombies, werewolves, and vampires.
So since we pretty much wrapped up with the statement that we are looking at, if it doesn't feel real to us, whatever world building we've done is wasted. And we have to basically take maps, cultures, whatever we draw on for our own resources, whether that's experience or whether that's actually just going in and going, I have to do it this way because I'm so detail oriented. And that's you, Angela. I hate to say it.
It is.
The reason you are such a stickler on the map is because you are a detail oriented person.
Yeah.
She ain't the only one.
Those details are sitting there in front of you, and that's what you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the whole reason you defend the map, use of the map as you have it in front of you at that time.
Yeah.
Because that's the way you are. So with the wrapping up on all of this, world building, regardless of whether you draw your own maps, whether you draw on maps from the real world, whether you're taking elements and changing them, drawing on cultures, drawing on locations or whatever, the key factor here, it's you do what you need to do as a writer to create a realism for yourself that you can transfer to the page for the reader. And at the end of the day, unless it feels real to you, we don't expect the readers to get that immersion into the culture, into the setting, into the geography that is required to hold them in place and give them a sense of the reality that we've got stuck in our heads.
Yeah.
I think that's fair to say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd say so. Another thing I wanted to add in describing things, what I like to describe just enough to let the reader's own imagination add to it. I don't want to describe everything so well that it confuses them because they're trying to think of something else. An example is in my second Ranger book, they actually go into a place called World Between Worlds. And this is a place where both reality and unreality both exist. And that was a tricky thing for me because I had to draw on some really deep dreams and things to describe a world where nothing seemed like you expected it to seem. So I've got quite a bit in there, and I think rather than trying to describe it exactly the way that I saw it, I gave just enough to let the reader's own imagination fill in the empty spaces. So I think that's important. Let the reader use their imagination while reading, as well as your own.
Yeah, I think that's important to let the reader's imagination take them to a certain point, beyond the point where you've actually got it described on paper, because without that, the reader isn't seeing or feeling the world. You can only give them so much before you have to let them take over, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's part of what creates the immersion for readers.
Yes. I agree.
So would we at this point say we've pretty much exhausted the topic for today? I know there's going to be further discussions on this down the line.
Probably in 365
So what I'm going to do, if everyone's okay. Oh, almost certainly in 365 days.
In 365
You know I'm
days,
back for next year and doing another panel
we'll
run.
probably need to review this topic again. This is one that just keeps coming back every year.
And I think we're going to have more people coming on board with their own views on this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and sign off. I'm going to say I've been Timothy Bates and I've been your host for this panel. As always, I'm the author of Urban Fantasy and Science Fiction. I can be found at timothybatesonauthor.weebly.com or timothybatesonauthor.wordpress.com. I'm all over Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, and Instagram. So go ahead, look me up. I'm going to give Aziza the chance to go ahead and introduce and say goodbye because unfortunately we didn't get to you earlier. So Aziza, if you wouldn't mind stepping in at this point.
Sure. I am Aziza Spinks. I actually write across the board, but today and for I guess the rest of the weekend, I am writing and looking at my fantasy, science fantasy, urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy kind of persona. I do love what I do. I love my readers. I love other writers. I think we all kind of play off of each other and with each other. And so far, so good. Everybody's played nicely. You can find me on, you can find me on the web at www.azizaspinks.com. I'm just like everybody else, all over Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest. So if you feel like you kind of want to play around in the dark, I don't write just about vampires. I do have a couple of wraiths and a couple of reapers, and death seems to be my friend. So if you're looking for works kind of in those realms, definitely look me up.
Tom?
I'm Tom Farwell. You can find me at tomfarwell.com. I'll tell you right now, if you do a search on Google for Tom Farwell, 4 L's, you're going to find me because there's only 3 of us in the United States, and I'm the only one writing books. So, you can also, if you happen to be in Atlanta at JordanCon in a couple of weeks, I will be at JordanCon. So.
Angela, Miss Brain to Books herself.
I am Angela B. Chrysler, author of Dolor and Shadow, Broken, Fire and Lies, and Zombies from Space and Vampires. I can be found at angelabchrysler.com, and I'm also owner and host of Brain to Books and the Brain to Books Cyber Convention. More details available at braintobooks.com.
And I would like to say thank you, Angela, for hosting this once again. It's an absolute pleasure being able to go straight through without having those 40-minute time cutouts. And this has been your Brain to Books Fantasy discussion panel on world building. Catch us in a little over 2.5 hours now for our second panel of the day on mixing fantasy with other genres. So, Angela, if you would go ahead.